Hello everybody and most welcome to Sköllersta in southern Närke, and one of the middle provinces here in Sweden. And we have a mild but cloudy day with some drizzles of rain, I believe. And we are very anxious for the coming weekend with the seminars and interesting meetings. And finally, we have a live person, an extra live person here in Sköllersta. I've been thinking of putting those things that we went through or read through in the earlier lectures into a new context. A little Bonian device to see what that leads to. And I start with something hazardous, and that's a saying from the local priest in Cassandra in Greece, and he said something at one instance: "You don't believe in God, you worship him." And it never struck my mind exactly what he meant, but it sounded profound and intriguing at the moment. So I will make that the starting point of this lecture, and I will go into different areas, not only God, but also politics, to make it wider and with more possible connections. I have some questions. Is believing in God some private language thing? Is it not open to the public, the exterior? Is it not visible? Something completely internal. And could it be that believing in something always take in the opposite? Like in this illustration. Crude model of the object, and the object, the essence, takes its force from not being non-essence, that is, empty space or what have you. What else there is, one could say too. But I'm going to use the phrase for simplicity, space. And in some ways it is space. We earlier talked about Richard E. Lind and his historical odyssey about the reflective consciousness that sets up an object in empty space in front of a subject. That's the working method of the reflective consciousness. And starting with that, one could say that the reflective consciousness creates an artificial world. And in that case, if that is, God would be yet another object set up in empty space, belooked by a subjective. And now is put into play the unnerving game of existence and not existence, because they are here connected. We say something has existence in distinction to something that does not exist, that is empty space. And in a certain regard, this new God cannot be any smaller, because it's inside the reflective consciousness, and it's defined by the subject as being not empty space, being existence. And how is this existence proved? Well, it's proved by the empty space. The empty space is part of the proof, the evidence. So the lack is inherent from the beginning. Something is lacking because the proof of God is something that is not God. It's a little bit like saying to a child, don't believe in ghosts. You are mentioning ghosts. And this is called the object in space facing subject. But this is also a game played out towards others. There is an interaction here in connectiveness. You do this also to trying to have advantages or please others, or what you presume others want from you. Because in the subjective consciousness, in the reflective consciousness, you don't really have any connections to the world. So it's your own game that plays out towards others. Therefore, one could say that there is a tendency striving to that in somewhere in the mid-18th century, religion also became more of a social construction, something in society. And at that time, religion came to assume an ordering, a structure that looked amazingly similar to another thing that evolved in that period. And that was ideology. We had politics before the 18th century, but it was in the 18th century ideologies started to develop. A written credo, something that should be believed in or defended. And it's also in this era the first start of new religion that is not the old religion starts, like the Quakers. They are organized in a different way than the old religion. It's based on almost like an ideology when it comes to the structure of the groups, congregations. And it seems also to be based on some sort of ideology. The Quakers, for instance, most of the ideology is in contradistinction to the Church of England, because it started there. And in this contradistinction you get a sort of an ideology that is similar to the political parties developing in the 18th century. Like getting an ideology, you're a revolutionist, or maybe you're a Whig or something. This is getting more structured. And this is also in this time era, the idea of left and right is established, which is also interesting. It actually started how the people in the first made up parliament were sitting. Whether sitting to the right or sitting to the left. So it's starting in this era, and I think for most people today, left and right is so firmly established, so we have it in our back of our heads. We don't have to doubt what it is. but it was established in this era. And interestingly enough, left always discussed with the right discussed with the left, and they did define each other. It was a mutual defining. Who am I? Well, I am in contrast to the other group. This became obvious when political parties from different countries come to meet. It turned out they developed differently in each country and also in each town. So I have a proposition here. Let's compare post-18th century religion with the 18th century political party system. Whereas political parties in some ways are akin to guilds or clubs, modern political system with ideology starts in the 18th century. Then you have a project, something you want to do, turn over society, take away the church, break down the class system, something like that. It's defined in contradiction. What do you want to destroy? And what do you want to have instead? It's also defined in oppositions. We don't have equality. That is what we want to have. But also religion in this era has a sort of a credo and ideology, and that's even clearer when we step into the 19th century. With the Methodist, I'm going to take the Methodist as an example here. Let's assume that we have a group of Methodists, and a political party. Let's compare them. Let's make a comparison. Number one, to some extent, or to great extent, in this context, belief means to defend the arguments one have against the other party or the other religion or the unbelievers, the surrounding space. This is called definition by contrast, or is just contrast. The idea is two arguments are against each other, and the argument that I represent, or the club I'm in, is to be defended against the other. Within the organization, this is the second thing, to strengthen the arguments within the party or the congregation. It will be papers distributed and printed. There will be public debates. That happened with the Methodists, that also happened with the Whig Party. Later, one could make recordings to distribute, but also papers. They both had regular papers, and in the end, they were on a daily basis. And these papers had a dual purpose, both serving as paper, but before everything else, to defend the arguments against the others. And you have a whole connectivism with different papers attacking each other, defining each other by a discussion. And that actually in the end became a progression in itself, and it started, I could say, a language game. That's later went incorporated into the party/congregations. One indication of this, if you look into sort of credos or writings from the Methodists in the era, a lot of things seems awfully dated. Well, because they are taken in contradistinction to a government/church that is outdated. If you contradict something that is outdated, you'll be outdated yourself, but it of course wasn't outdated at the time. But that shows to me it's obviously in contradistinction to the Church of England at that time. Not because if there should be some criticism this early, not because they believed it themselves from their inner self somehow. Within the congregation, within the club, also this happened, even if there were no outsiders. Arguments are to be reinforced. And in the local club, there were discussions both in the Methodist and the political parties to reinforce the arguments against each other, help each other, and also making them even a little bit stronger by testing them on each other. So you can see this is working anyway. This is still giving a momentum. And I'd say to take it one level further down, when you go home, even if you are a Whig to some extent, or you are a Methodist, at the family, in the family, this will continue to a certain extent. Maybe you're the family father, and at the dinner table you would tell your family members what you believe in or what they should believe in, or have discussions to further the arguments. And that would be also with the Whig Party, be some discussions, furthering of the arguments, and maybe the wife doesn't agree, and that makes both the arguments stronger. Maybe she's Tory. It could happen. Not very likely in those days, but women didn't have a vote in those days, I don't think. I think it could have happened. Well, let's get over to the organization. You have a political leadership and you have a religious leadership. They are sort of ruling the party. They're usually put in place by some sort of democracy or natural order. But they are also, especially some of them, like whips. And whips is a British expression. And being a whip means that you keeping sort of discipline when it comes to opinions. Not how you are dressed or if you shave, but the opinions. A whip is to see that people have proper opinions, so it doesn't diverge too much. But their thing is also to reinforce the beliefs already present in the club or the political party or the congregation. That's the purpose of a whip. Some people are more whips than others. Some are maybe more administration leaders to take decisions. Where should we stay? Should we move to another house? How are we going to regulate the economy? That's a different thing. But the whip, he or she has more purpose of reinforcing the arguments. And it's the whip in the end that takes the debate to the outside. Public debate. That becomes recorded in newspapers. And if you are a Whig member, that argument could happen in the Parliament, for instance, in the House of Commons. And if you're Methodist, that would be in those discussions they had on a regular basis with the Church of England. Could also, by proxy, happen in the newspapers. Maybe in a neutral newspaper like the London Times, an exchange of articles that first the Methodists write something, and then the Church of England writes something, or somebody else. And then you have an exchange, you have a sharpening of definitions, you have a sharpening of the arguments. It's co-defining process. And the role of the whip is partly also to keep the order within the party or the congregation, because you have always problem where you have a group of people, people who not behave. We remember that from the Sverigedemokraterna, especially in the beginning. We had loads of people not behaving at all, causing a disaster. And horrible things even that happen in both political parties and religious parties, religious congregations. Violence.
I'm now reading autobiography by Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, and around 1906 he was advocating for voting rights for women. So he went to a political party to speak about this. So there were one person who bought in a bag 2 big rats, and he let them loose so that the women, so in order to make the women go crazy and show how weak they are. But finally, some men who were on the side of the women, they catch them, got them.
Okay.
So you see there is a...
Well, I think those, how do you say, excursions into the past can make this thinking clearer. Because when I also look at the old credo ideology, both for the whips and of the Methodists, you can see it's very dated. And then you understand those ideas are taken in contradistinction to other people at that time. Indirectly, you can understand that. They're both very dated. And it's an interesting process. Well, let's have an example. A friend of mine, Torsten, he is a political whip. He is good with arguments, he's participating in public debates, and he also has the purpose of keeping the discipline within the orders and on opinion bias. So he provides argument, and that's not a small service. That's a big job, because you usually lose debates because of lack of arguments. And that is not easy to produce arguments. Let me give an example I experienced myself, and you can debate me on this because this is Swedish modern history, so I would like to hear your opinions. But I'd say in Sweden in the early 70s, the opposition had taken a minority role for such a long time. They actually defined themselves as being the minority. They call themselves the minority, but not only that. They define themselves according to the ruling party, the one that were criticizing. They defined themselves.
You mean the Socialdemokrats?
Yes. And in debates, as soon as things came up that was regarding social justice and such stuff. Are you protecting the citizen? Are you being for a good state? The opposition always said, we're not. So they accepted that. And to accept that, it's very hard to debate consistently for years. You lose the battle in the end, and it starts to becomes reality. It is reality in a way. And I think that we have another thing that could be very helpful to understand this tendency. But if I've been looking at the arguments at that time, and every time the Social Democrats say anything about being a good state or taking care of its citizens, it's always the opposition gives up directly. They admit it indirectly. And It even went so far that the leader for the opposition, Gösta Bohman, was called a bloody fascist. And he got away with it. It was Olof Palme that called him that. And look at the party at that time, at the 70 of the opposition party, the right. It's ludicrous. Their ideology is so left you won't even believe it. They want they want a little lower tax than the Social Democrats, but you're still talking 45%. Highest taxes in the world. You define yourself. In the end, you define yourself. And this is how reality comes by, because this is part of reality in a way we don't have words to describe. And I'd say that makes us sitting ducks. But let me go back. Sorry about my deviation here. I digressed a bit. I'm talking about my friend, the political whip, Torsten. He's in the leadership of a political party, and he does most of the public debate. But he also does it internally, towards the members, to help them re-argument and fix arguments that are not very good. They could be not very clear, they could be not showing the ideology of a particular party, which is very common because these things are more complicated than we think. But here comes the interesting part. He is also a leader of a congregation. So he has two purposes. Not in this, the party and the congregation is not the same. But he also does that. He has a double job. He doesn't combine them, but it's a double job. When it comes to religion, he does pretty much the same thing. He's taking public argument, and he's also helping the people within the congregation with arguments and thinking. And he does a very good job. But it's a striking similarity. And one problem this foundation I'm going to take today is this one I showed before here. This needs to be complemented by a later lecture or your own thinking. But I'd say the arguments are not holistic or non-dual, because they are always taken in contradistinction to a perceived opposer. And when I say perceived, that's, you have to think reality is also a construction for the reflective consciousness. So you are almost fighting an enemy you can't really see or imagine, somewhere in between there. That's the problem with this contradistinction. There are a lot of good things with contradiction, but this is a problem because you tend to leave where it's coming from. You get a little further away for each time you do that. We create objects. I would call these things objects as well, because it's easier to understand. They are very similar, and the argumentation, it's taking place in a space, in a perceived space, and the space that's not your space, that's the opposing team. And you might as well call that empty space. But you define yourself according to that other thing that's not you. Philosophically, that is called the other, with a big O, the other, you got to learn. So I'd say objects, and now I'm also talking about these ordinary objects, in a way they're not being material or real. So the objects of materialism are not materially proper, because then that would have some sort of insight. This is in opposition. And I can say that this exist for the subject seeing an object in space in contradistinction to the space around it. But that's not the whole story. This thing has an inside, and this doesn't make for an inside, doesn't look into the objects. Doesn't look into the objects, remember that. So what happens a bit, and here I'm quite certain, you getting further away from where it started by this constant contradiction, taking things in contradiction and building up things that way. So you become a little bit distant. You don't know the inside of your opposition anymore. You just perceive his or her outside. Well, I'm talking about the party as well. It's outside, the outside of the political party. And it becomes a bit superficial in a way, a bit superficial. And in the end, your relation to those things would be like what we call in Swedish brylling. And that's a cousin 3 times removed. That's what they call it in English. Very, very distant relative. I think it's the most distant relative we have here in Sweden. It's brylling. It's the son or daughter of the cousin get another son or daughter, which is going to be the syssling, and they get a son and daughter, and they are the brylling. And that's called in English 3 times removed cousin. It becomes very distant. I think the analogy is quite good because it's a division each time. You get 1 step further away, 1 step further away. Think about the family tree like this, you get further away, and you share less and less things. Jay Leno said, and this is another aspect, politics is show business for ugly people. Very famous site by Jay Leno. He's a talk show host. But a theater, I think, could actually be a very good example. I'm myself, I'm a musical eclectic. And if it's not too sleazy folk music or how to say dansbandsmusik, if it's too sleazy I can't stomach it, but everything else I can take. Any sort of music. I'm very interested in those things as well. And these days you have fantastic opportunity to listen to music from all over the world. And the last couple of weeks I've been listening to music coming from the former Soviet republics. And that's quite interesting. We need to remember those republics were very isolated before because they were inside the Soviet Union. They were the most distant part of Soviet Union, and Soviet Union had very hard borders there. So they had very little to non-contact with the outside world. But thanks to the internet, they can copy. And when it comes to music, you not only copy in music, you make a sort of a pictorial music video. And when you look at those videos, you get amazed how good they are, but they're also incredibly similar to the Western one. It's gestures, it's things you can see they do with their faces that I can't imagine they normally do. Western things, lifting one eyebrow when getting up a tone, that's very Western. I actually seen them sing before, real life, and they don't move their eyebrows when they sing. It's a Western approach. I think it's actually Italian from the beginning, coming from the opera, adding a little humanity to the singing, whereas they usually sing with a still face. And I'd say, actually, especially one of the better videos, maybe they had help from Western personnel, or they were very good at copying what they saw on the internet. It's very hard to see the difference these days. They are so similar they could actually be in the same group. So, and then I heard people saying the whole world is similar to that. They look at those videos and say they are the same. And here in this more obvious example, I think the subject looking at an object in space is actually coming up into the open, that tendency. Whereas if I would have talked to somebody from a political party or religious group, they would have defended themselves. They would already have argument against this and say, yeah, I wouldn't say that, I couldn't say that. But here in this case, because it doesn't feel so important, people could say without feeling ashamed, the whole world is the same. Which of course is beyond ridiculous. I don't even have words for it. How could a person whose parents were tribal herdsmen become the same because they are very good at imitating what's taking place in a musical video? The chances are this. But I think here the same thing is happening in this other instance, religious group and the party. But there they have ready-made arguments to defend them if I would have catched them, and I would say, no, we don't think that. The arguments is the same as God or something, or you can understand the opposition just by looking at them, or what they write in the ideology paper. But I think they're deceiving themselves, or revealing themselves here. And here I come to the odd point, one of the odd points here. It's a bit weird that people, or us, I would say, because I have to include myself, are mainly essentialists. We are looking for the core thing, the essence. But is it not weird? What are we actually looking at? We are looking at the surface, and we say that's reality. So we essentialists, we materialists, we don't have a desire to understand any essence or any insight. We actually define an object, and this is true. This is how we define an object. What is around it in a two-dimensional flat world, the photographic world, the central perspective. Something that's been tested and proven, and we can ask Jan tomorrow. It's very interesting, but that's what objects are mainly. There's no inside. So why is that we say that we are essentialists or try to look for the essence? That's quite interesting, actually. But we're not interested in any essence. And that was a sure giveaway to say that these, I think it was Kazakhstan, and I showed it to like 10 people, and they said, that was similar these days. It looked just like a Western band, and it was the same tones and everything. They're not the same. The parents were tribal herdsmen. The similarities can possibly be less than a billionth of a percent. It's ludicrous. And they call themselves essentialists. Shame them, or shame myself. It's pretty amazing. But if I would have spoken to a political party member, he would never admit to that. He would never say those things, because there are already arguments made against those attacks. But here we don't have arguments built up. We need to remember there are actually party whips, and my example that covered politics and religion, but that doesn't mean that it's of just those two areas. I take those as examples for all other areas, like PR, marketing, I'd say also this is happening in sports, this is happening in movies, and it's a tendency. It's very interesting, and there are actually people that written about this in I think cinema, I can't pronounce it, cinematography, and it's a double-sided thing within cinema. It's becoming more superficial, but it also is something's added. So it's quite interesting in the end. But we need to remember still, even the even it's the case, many interesting thing comes up, and that could be very fruitful. There's no doubt about that, and this is furthering the development. We need to remember it's 3 times removed from reality, and do not make the mistake and say that the son of a tribal herdsman is Western because he dresses up in a Western way and it lifts his eyebrow, and he's so Western. People have no idea. You don't see that in China ever. It never happens. There are some dead giveaways when people are imitating. You know they don't do that. It doesn't happen. Well, I think it's a very good time to round up. I
Thank
say
you.
thank you